Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today to the second episode of Meet the Professor. Our guest for today is Professor Paul Katsafanas, a professor of philosophy at Boston University. He specializes in concepts like agency, ethics, and the mind by drawing off of works of historical philosophers like Nietzsche and Kant. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me today, Professor Katsafanas.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. Thanks for the
Yeah,
invitation.
thank you for coming as well. To begin, I'd like to ask you, why do you think people, especially students, should pursue philosophy?
Well, I think it's an incredibly rewarding subject. So, one of the things I find most interesting about it is the way in which it teaches us to question much of what we would ordinarily just take for granted. So, the claims that we're inclined to believe about the world, about life, about our values. There are a lot of powerful philosophical arguments that call those into question and make us wonder how much of what we take for granted might actually be false or distorted.
Yeah, I definitely got an interest in philosophy for like a lot of those reasons. For you in particular, what drew you into philosophy? Like, for example, what was your first interaction?
So, I guess my first interaction with philosophy was in college when without really knowing what it was going to be, I signed up for a great books course my freshman year. And some of what we read in that course was classics of philosophy. So we read a bit of Plato, Descartes, Nietzsche, and a few other philosophers, if I remember correctly. And I was just immediately captivated by it. So I found the works that we were reading incredibly gripping and fascinating. And I think that's what initially drew me into it. But it was a bit of an accident because I didn't really know what I was getting into when I signed up for that course.
Yeah, that's really cool and interesting. You mentioned a lot of the classics and those authors. Once people are interested in philosophy, what sort of books, publications, podcasts, papers, etc., should they be looking to read or listen to?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a hard question to answer just because there's so much, and where you start would really depend on what areas of philosophy you're interested in. But one thing that I always found tends to grip newcomers to philosophy was some of Arthur Schopenhauer's work. So he's a 19th century German philosopher, and he's famously pessimistic. So he thinks that life is horrible in a lot of ways, and he has these very interesting arguments for that conclusion. It's a depressing conclusion, but it does make you think. So he writes in German, but there's one old translation of his works that's called Studies in Pessimism, and it's a bunch of short essays. And that's an interesting place if you're interested in these questions about the value of life and so forth. With Nietzsche, who I do a lot of work on, the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, I think his book, The Genealogy of Morality, is probably the easiest of his books to start with. So that could be a good place. If you wanted something more contemporary, though, some philosophy that's being written by people who are currently alive, then one book that I encountered fairly early on and found very interesting was a book by Christine Korsgaard called The Sources of Normativity. And it's a little challenging, but it's about ethics and about the way we might justify the ethical claims that we accept and so forth. So, yeah, so those would be three suggestions. There's obviously a lot more that you could branch out into, but those are some works that I found particularly interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned how you drew a lot off of Nietzsche and all those philosophers. Could you explain a little bit more in depth about your research in that area?
Sure. Well, so Nietzsche is famously critical of traditional moral assumptions. So he thinks that most of what we ordinarily believe about what's good and bad and right and wrong and so forth is just mistaken in very important ways. So, what a lot of his work is sort of geared up to do is to investigate why we accept the moral and valued claims that we accept and to think about whether there's any good justification for them or whether some alternative set of claims might be better, might be more appropriate. So in doing that, he develops these very interesting psychological theories about what motivates human beings, what our deepest strivings are, and so forth. So I've written a lot about that. He also writes a lot about the interaction between conscious thoughts and unconscious thoughts. So he thinks that we tend to underappreciate how much of our mental lives is unconscious and how profoundly that affects the small portion that is actually conscious. So he has a lot of interesting things to say about that as well. So those are some of the topics that I've written on.
Yeah, yeah. So given that he's so fundamentally radical and different from a lot of thinkers, how can we apply his work to like public policy or our own decisions to take into account the discoveries that he made?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a couple of things that Nietzsche teaches us to do. One thing is just to be very skeptical about the moral and evaluative claims that we ordinarily take for granted, to think very carefully about whether what we sort of intuitively believe to be right is actually what we should be striving for, or whether something more complex and multifaceted is needed. So keeping attention on those topics, on the status of the values that we're appealing to, I think that's something you can glean from Nietzsche. I also think this point about how complex human psychology is really important. So, we tend to think that we ordinarily know what we're doing and why we're doing it, why we believe what we believe, why we're gripped by the politics or the religion or the values that we're gripped by. But reading Nietzsche, I think you see that you really need to delve a lot deeper and uncover some of the hidden factors that are driving people to accept those sorts of positions and those sorts of values. So being skeptical about not just the values we accept, but what's driving us to accept those values, what's underlying our beliefs at the conscious level and so forth. I think those are some things that Nietzsche teaches us to be very careful with and to think clearly about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So now, besides Nietzsche, who do you think your favorite philosopher, historical or contemporary, really is?
Yeah, that's a tough question because there's so many great philosophers. So I mentioned Schopenhauer, who I admire. I think he's really interesting. There are a lot of other philosophers. I think Hegel is a brilliant philosopher, for example. But I guess if I had to sort of set just one alongside Nietzsche, I've always been very fascinated by Iris Murdoch. She's a 20th century, mid 20th century British philosopher and novelist. So she not only wrote some really wonderful philosophical works, but also a lot of great novels. And I think she's profoundly insightful on a lot of the same points that Nietzsche talks about, actually. So the complexity of human psychology. And she's very interested in the way in which our psychologies, our characters, shape the way that we view the world and what we see in the world. So a lot of her novels and philosophical works explore that dimension of human psychology. And I think they're actually very approachable. So that's also a good place to start if you're new to philosophy, by reading some of her novels or philosophical works.
Yeah, that was like really insightful, and all of what you said has been really insightful. Thank you for speaking with me today, Professor Katsafanas.
Sure, I'm happy to do so.